Good morning, everybody. This is your video for week 3, I believe. The article on the HeLa cell and a discussion about sort of science. I also, just to begin with, I realize there's some kind of weird, there's no water system, there's no heat that's on here, there's nothing blowing. Not really sure why sometimes it's hard to hear, so I'm going to try to speak a little bit louder in the hopes that you'll actually be able to hear what I'm saying for most of this little sort of quick chat. So, having read the article in your lecture, looking to connect it sort of to the world that you live in, a couple of things come to mind when I read the article about the HeLa cell and think about Henrietta Lacks. That is that particularly where not only race and gender are concerned, we see in the world that we're living in today on our social media how this is playing out. Black Lives Matter. Think about the number of black women who have been killed recently, whose characters are immediately sort of suspect. Further, there was just an officer arrested and sentenced to whatever, 1 million years in jail or something for sexual assault of a number of black women, some of whom struggled with addiction, some of whom were extraordinarily poor, but definitely marginalized women. And the sort of social conversation and some of the commentary around this case was that he was a cop, and like, who were these women, right? Could we really trust what they were saying? Now, we hear that kind of conversation often. We're going to see some of that, I think, play out where the Jian Ghomeshi trial is concerned. But what's particularly interesting about those cases is that most of those women were black, so marginalized by race, as I said, also perhaps by other social factors like economics and issues of addiction, this kind of thing, poverty. But in the background, kind of a conversation around African American people in general is this sort of hypersexual theme that has been going on forever. They were used as breeders during slavery. In terms of pornography, there's often a conversation about black men's virility and, size of genitalia, this sort of thing. And these conversations happen as though we can be certain that this stuff is rooted in nature. It shouldn't take us, very much critical thinking to really be clear that there's obviously something else at play here, and that is a social factor, and it is about race. But in fact, so often we engage in conversation and sort of social banter and this sort of thing at the expense of African American people, with this assumption that this embedded sort of hypersexuality is just a fact. It has implications for sort of the moral character of the people that are in question in any kind of conversation. Think about, during slavery, having people up on blocks, right, stripped naked, and having all of the rich white folks bid on them. Often genitalia was a really big part of that process. Now, during segregation and the sort of social fermentation and struggle that was happening then, we also see that when a black man was accused of sexual assault of a white woman, circumstances were very, very different than if a white man had been accused of sexually assaulting a black woman. And in large measure at that time, it wasn't really taken to be even possible that a white man could assault a black woman, that it was even possible for a sexual assault to be committed against sort of a person of that nature, right, who's so very overtly sexual, hypersexual, and kind of, in some ways, as a throwback to slavery, what they were for. Further to which I think we can take it to another sort of area in terms of social media and the kinds of things that we see playing out, and again, often take for granted are scrolling past on our phones or our Facebook feeds or whatever. Amber Rose, who was married to Kanye West and Wiz Khalifa, not married to Kanye West, but linked to Kanye West and also to Wiz Khalifa, and they share a child. There's just in the last, I'm going to say 6, 8, 10 months, there's been kind of a lot of conversation going on between the two of them, or three of them. Lots of social media, tweeting back and forth, this sort of thing. Amber Rose used to be apparently a stripper. I'm not sure how that's relevant to any of the conversation that's been ongoing. I mention it simply to highlight that that is something that comes up all the time. She's a black woman. She no longer needs either of those men. You know, she's a sort of got some notoriety of her own and is successful in her own right. So they continually bring it up as a way to discredit her, to shame her, to kind of make her inconsequential. And this is a particularly interesting example of this, I think, because it shows just how prevalent and insidious this idea that there's a bit of a substrata of humanity, or subspecies sort of theme going on, that it's been internalized by black people as well in the States. And this is, you know, some internalized self-hatred maybe, but certainly having been socialized in an environment where this is a common theme, and where so many of us take for granted these ideas that as being rooted in science and sort of being how they are, just how things are, right? It's just the natural way of things. That this is engaged in, you know, even by people who belong in some measure to the same group, right? Because the dominant discourse has been that this is true, this is fact. Our science, you know, has bolstered up the social practices from, you know, previous sort of ages, if you will, age of slavery, segregation, this kind of thing, so that it's common practice to utilize these themes as a way to just take somebody down a peg, knock at someone's credibility, validity, value, and it happens so often that I think, you know, we scroll past this stuff. We don't even necessarily see it, right? We have the same thing sort of at work here when you think about our Indigenous people and missing and murdered women. It's very hard often for our social body to acknowledge that the problem isn't somehow an inherent problem with the women who go missing, that they aren't somehow complicit, that this isn't something that they've done, that it isn't really just about being an Indigenous woman. And this is what happens. This is the natural sort of trajectory for Indigenous women. It's not, right? But our social body is vested in the idea that there's some superiority. This goes back to a narrative around the civilized and uncivilized, right? The savage that needed to be tamed. And that in large measure is also rooted in nature, right? In a discourse around the natural way of things, the natural sort of order of things. And so when we look at the HeLa cell and the conversation around, you know, how it has survived in culture and sort of propagated itself and all of these things, and the things that are left out of that particular conversation, and the things that are assumed that the author talks about, right? How it's transported and whatever, that didn't just like fling itself across the continent, but that we've imbued it with all kinds of you know, sort of personal characteristics that fit the narrative of, you know, of racism being rooted in nature. And so often I think, you know, where science is concerned, we take that stuff for granted. We assume that our scientific community knows that they're telling us the truth, that science is objective. And as with everything else, as pointed out by this particular article, you know, the way that we know things and how we come to know things is absolutely filtered through our socialization, through the cultural worlds that we live in, the social bodies that we are part of. And so in developing critical thinking about these things, it's really important to remember that science is not this objective thing that stands out here on its own, completely removed from everything else, right? It's still part of the world we live in, and so that all of the things that are operative in the world that we live in, whether we're aware of it or not, are also operative here. And so truth is, you know, perhaps not as objective. The scientific truth of a thing may not be as objective and neutral as we've been, you know, sort of led to believe. So I hope that helps to maybe make some links for you where this sort of chunk of the course is concerned to the world that you live in. I also just wanted to quickly note that I am making my way through the papers and I'm slowly getting the grades up. Marking online is slightly more difficult than marking on paper, so it's taking a little bit longer, but you should all have your grades within the next couple of days. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. Just a couple of notes, though, on the papers in general, and that is simply to say that please make sure that you're checking, sort of the grammar, the spelling, all the sort of basics, right? Those mechanical things to make sure that your paper is as clean and tidy as it can be. I haven't penalized anybody, profound amount this time around. It's the first paper. But I did want to make note that these are, despite the fact that you can use I and that they are sort of informal and they're like a personal response, it's still an academic paper that you're handing in for credit. And so you need to make sure that your spelling is on, that you're not missing words, that you're not saying women, one woman, many women, or some women, right? Plural, singular, some of those things. They just help to polish things up a little bit and show that you really have paid attention and that you've engaged your assignment in writing with some focus. So, on that note, have a good week. I'll see you back here next week, and I hope that this video is maybe a little bit easier to hear. I'll keep working on it to see what I can do kind of to suss out the volume problem. So have a good week, everybody. If you need anything, let me know. Take care.